amigos de Love for All? Me da mucho gusto estar con ustedes hoy. Soy Lu Botello, editora en jefe de Bebemundo, y tengo el gusto hoy de entrevistar a un personaje fabuloso que me tiene súper emocionada. Está con nosotros John Galligan, es el Senior Director de Global Government Affairs para Microsoft. Él dirige el equipo global de asuntos gubernamentales y entre sus actividades está desarrollar campañas que promueven el uso responsable e inclusivo de la tecnología. Además, John encabeza Cela Pride, que es la red de empleados LGBT del Departamento de Asuntos Corporativos Externos y Legal de Microsoft. Es un gran honor tener a John aquí. John, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Lou, it's a great pleasure. Thank you. And hola to everyone.
It's so nice to finally have this conversation where we want to talk about your personal evolution as well as how being part of an inclusive and very open company helped you so much in your journey.
Great pleasure. Thank you, Lou.
So I would love to ask you first, what was the big turning point for you and which institution helped you make it happen in your own process of coming out?
Thanks, Lou, for the question. And I really appreciate the opportunity to share some thoughts today. Like a lot of people watching this, I grew up in a big Catholic family, a really loving but very, very devout and, very religious upbringing. Went to Catholic boys' school, went to church every weekend. My parents were very, very devout. So the environment in which I grew up in was incredibly loving, incredibly charitable, incredibly, I think, a very positive one on many fronts. But unfortunately, the Catholic Church and, my parents' sort of observance of religion didn't give me many role models to follow. And so in some ways, while I don't criticize the church for being, charitable and for part of who I am, the one thing it did crowd out was just the chance for me to have some role models and for me to be able to sort of identify with people who were like me, because in many ways, fitting in was the thing you had to do. And so in some ways, sort of standing out or being different was absolutely sort of the wrong thing. And so in some ways, you sort of try to be part of something that might not necessarily you should be part of. And so it really wasn't until I started work and went into, the corporate world, which may sound strange because normally the corporate world is where you must fit in. You don't be different. It follow the rules. It's probably even less embracing than maybe even the church. But what I found is that, there was far more of a openness to diversity. There was certainly more of a bring your authentic self. Certainly my experience in nearly 15 years at Microsoft, it has been clearly a huge part of who I am as a professional. But it's really wonderful that they do mean what they say when they said, bring your authentic self, be more of who you are. And it really took me sort of like a surprise where it required me to sort of like tap into my professional environment for me to really sort of like come out and be who I am. And really in some ways it's important because you tend to put your own prejudice on other people, feeling that they are going to have a negative reaction to, you being your authentic self. And oftentimes that energy that you've been expending, sort of trying to sort of project what you think might be their fear, their misunderstanding, their inability to understand sort of who you are, is such a wasteful energy. And when you go to a corporate environment, which is diverse, which is embracing diversity, it's a place that actually can be more cathartic when it comes to sort of bringing out who you are, because that is part of its mission. It's part of its values. And so I really claim sort of my work experience to be far more impactful than my family or society in sort of allowing me to be who I am. So I would sort of say in many ways, organizations, commercial organizations and companies do a great role at sort of allowing people to be their authentic self.
Well, from hearing you, I understand, and many other people have told me that you don't come out only once in your life. You come out many times, and sometimes at work, sometimes with family. So as I understand it, coming out in a very positive working environment helped you in the other areas of your life with other people?
Absolutely. I would actually, I think about maybe it's not that amusing, but it certainly dates me. It was actually at a Ricky Martin concert of all places that I was really confronted by a very, very valued colleague. And the company was putting on a night at the concert for its employees and their partners and their husbands and wives. And I went by myself. And this was in Auckland, New Zealand, many years ago, about 20 years ago. And my colleague came up to me and they said, "Where is your partner?" And I said, "Oh, they're at home." And they said, "Why are they here?" And I said, "Well, I didn't invite him." And they said, "Why wouldn't you invite him? Everyone else is bringing their husbands, their wives, their partners. Why wouldn't you bring him?" And I said, "Well, I didn't think it was appropriate." And she said to me, "Look, you get to enjoy meeting everyone else's partners. Why are you denying us the right to know yours?" And it may have seemed, sort of a trivial thing to say at the time, at a concert, Ricky Martin shaking his bonbon somewhere. But it really, really sort of like struck me that, here I was trying to protect my husband, or my then partner, but my now husband. I was trying to protect him from, an environment which I thought I was unsettled in. And then you realize, again, back to that idea of I put my prejudice on colleagues thinking that they wouldn't understand, when it was really me who didn't understand, that they wanted to know more about me. They wanted to meet the person who was the love of my life. And so, it required a sort of a general confrontation at a Ricky Martin concert, no less, for me to sort of understand sort of what I was trying to do was actually harming my husband, Jamie, my then partner, my now husband. That sometimes you can be overprotective and oversensitive. And again, that you project those prejudices on other people that simply aren't there. And so I think it required, me to be confronted, to have a little bit of bravery. And from that point forward, I vowed I would never ever sort of like do that, certainly to my husband and partner, but certainly sort of like, bring out more of my authentic self every day. Like you say, you do come out every day. And it can be a little exhausting because you do the calculus in the head about whether or not you want to have the discussion about, do you have a husband, or, are you, sometimes it just gets exhausting. But you realize that, like, just even using that energy to work out the calculus in your head is a waste of energy. And so you just be sort of like strong and stand behind your convictions. And, and either coming out every day can be a very cathartic experience, because it is about sort of like continuing to sort of be your authentic self and trying to be, who you are. It requires a little bit of energy to expense it, far more to hide yourself and to sort of just I suppose, displace comments than just to simply be true.
And that is a great thing to understand. After all, you've lived in many countries. You have the experience of being in a very conservative society when you lived in Singapore, and in a very open and tolerant society when you lived in Australia and New Zealand, where you went to the Ricky Martin concert. So I guess you have to realize there's judgment that you make and then judgment that society makes.
Yes, all the time. And, it's human nature. And sometimes it's a protective mechanism. But I think it's oftentimes an unwarranted protective mechanism, because there are more people out there who are interested in you, and who actually see that you are hiding a little bit of yourself, that you aren't being, true to yourself. And sometimes, as good at acting, as good as we might be, sort of like masking, parts of us, it's probably the most visible and the most transparent thing to everyone else. You think you're very good at it, but in many ways, I think we just kid ourselves and we deny others the joy of knowing us, and also to that waste of energy, as I mentioned before. I just think it's just in these days, we should be using that energy for other things than just trying to sort of like hide or displace or to, cover, certain parts of who we are.
Of course, I mean, any human being always has this challenge to truly be his or her own person, who they really are, who they are meant to be, versus what they think society expects of them, be it in any area: sexual orientation, tradition versus modern, intelligence, manners, the way they dress. I mean, there's so many things that we have to understand that shouldn't be an issue, that people, be themselves.
Yeah, and I think, we've just seen how much, even when you think about the LGBT plus, movement in the last few years, right. Diversity, even within that community, is more apparent than ever before. The fact that there are more letters than there were a few years ago is illustrative of just how diverse, our community is. And all of us have to sort of sometimes confront, we even have levels of ignorance and blind spots to even members of our own community. And I think part of our journey as members of the LGBTQ plus community is to be curious about others in our community, because oftentimes we can be very good at sort of knowing, our part of the rainbow.
Right.
But we've got to sort of be more curious, because I think what we're learning is that diversity is our strength as a community. We certainly have achieved more together. And then when we think about things like solidarity and allyship, there's nothing that can stop us as we think about using that curiosity and using that affinity to help others, not just in our own community, but others who are also suffering sort of like inequality or injustice, because we know what it's like to feel that ourselves. So in some ways, how do we sort of make sure that we are giving that energy and giving that support to others as well? But clearly, diversity, even within our community, is something we should be embracing.
I know. And that brings me to this term that you taught me, that it's called covering, which is when someone describes, someone tries to hide or minimize who they really are, or a very important part of who they really are, because they feel it makes them be inferior, or being perceived as inferior. And that, I think, it's a huge hazard in the workplace, because people can be fully into the work if they are all the time worried about hiding something.
Yeah, and covering is not like being in the closet.
Right.
It is not it's not a thing you only associate with the LGBTQ plus community. Everyone does it at some stage, whether or not it's some people hide that they have a disability. They may have a learning disability. They may have dyslexia. They may have an invisible disability like cancer. They may just have a way that they would wear their hair normally in their personal life, but they do it differently at work. The way they dress, the way they speak. Everyone at some stage, circumstantially, depending on the sort of the time, or just maybe it's something naturally you don't even know you're doing. I think we all engage in this. And there's a great book written by Professor Kenji Yoshino. He's at the New York University Law School. And he's studied this, and he's a gay man. And he was talking about just, as an Asian man, working in a very conservative area of work in terms of the legal profession. He was just talking about sort of the number of times that he was sort of just like covering aspects of his culture or his sexual orientation or other aspects to fit in. And he was just realizing just what a waste of time that was. And so he's written this fabulous book about just what sort of the idea of uncovering may be. And so it's, it's something you don't do once, a bit like we talked about. You don't come out just once. The idea of uncovering or making sure you don't cover is not something you do once and you're done. You always got to think about sort of like, when am I changing my personality? When am I changing my authentic self to fit in? Now, sometimes there are mores, sometimes there are conventions that, we do have to observe. We all live in cultures where certain things are just accepted. Now, that might necessarily be an area of covering because that's just, good manners, for instance. But, if you are denying, a part of yourself just to sort of see that you could fit in, just because you're afraid of what others may think, that is what covering is. And that's not something we should be, alert to. And, it's something that we went through a session with Kenji last year. And it was incredibly powerful because what it showed to everyone is doing elements of this. It's not just, a characteristic of people in our community. It is something that we all do. We have to be sort of mindful of. And in some ways, what it was amazingly sort of impactful, because everyone could understand then sort of for people who were sort of like in the closet or hiding their sexual orientation or hiding some other aspect of their gender identity. Everyone hides something at some stage, and they could understand the energy and the time and the sort of, just emotion that you have to just hide those things back. Could you imagine if someone's doing that every day, around their inner self? And so there was a great cathartic sort of like feeling across our organization when we went through this session, because everyone could understand what it meant for individuals who were feeling very, very relegated just because of their sexual orientation or gender identity.
I love it. I love it. Because it brings this concept that I really like, that help others elevate themselves, then the whole company is going to rise to a higher level of collaboration and of clarity and of communication.
Yeah, I mean, like, you would hate to be in an organization that just looked exactly like yourself. And here in the United States, and I'm sure it's in other parts of the world, including Mexico, everyone is looking at diversity in a different way. Certainly the issues of racial injustice are very profound and pronounced at the moment. And it's because there's underrepresentation and underrepresentation in areas of, of our business and, of our industry. And how do we ensure that we sort of balance the inequity and also to just the imbalance of representation? Because we know that, with different thoughts, different views, different experiences, different ways of thinking is the only way, a company can really thrive, because otherwise it can sort of like settle into itself. And that's probably the first day of its end of its existence. And so, I think the focus on diversity within companies is amazing. And I think that companies can teach, let's call it civil society and broader society, such a huge lesson, because it is such a business value from the right place. From it, it's the value of the company to be diverse, but they also know the business value of it. And so hopefully what we see is, corporate Mexico, corporate America, corporate wherever we may be, sort of lead by example and show that, diversity not only is just a good thing to do, it's also to an incredibly, important commercial value as well.
Yeah, it's a strength. It's certainly a strength within a company and within a country. As we know, the U.S. just, the recent Supreme Court just granted civil rights protection to the LGBT workers. So what would that mean in the long term for employers and employees?
Yeah, look, it was so amazing to wake up, last Monday morning, to this news. And I'd been sort of involved in some of the early discussions about, whether or not this case was worth taking to the court, because, it's an interesting time to sort of take these very important human rights and civil rights actions to what is sometimes considered a very conservative court. People worry that if the law was settled in a particular way, it could actually affect, in a very negative way, so many people in our community. But you look at the bravery of those plaintiffs who decided to go forward. One of them, who was unfortunately passed away, the trans woman who passed away just before the judgment. And you think of the bravery that those people sort of took to sort of essentially sort of like ensure that the civil rights that everyone else takes for granted was going to extend to LGBT, communities. That, as some, writer said, that this is the first time in history that a gay couple could get married on the Sunday and not be fired on the Monday for their sexual orientation. And it may seem like a small thing in the scheme of things, but these wins that we've seen over the last few years here in the United States, like, I got married to my partner of this month is 22 years here in the United States, because I couldn't get married in our home country of Australia. They didn't have marriage equality until very recently. I certainly couldn't get married in Singapore. And so it took, 17 years before we moved here to the United States for me to actually marry, sort of the love of my life. And probably for many years, we just sort of assumed we were never going to be able to get married. But I tell you what, once you have that choice, and once everyone accepts that it's just sort of part of the society you live in, it is a remarkable thing to sort of be part of, just that feeling. And then when you wake up, as I said, last Monday and read the court's decision, and you realize for the first time trans rights are actually being mentioned, in a judgment of the Supreme Court of the United States, it's quite remarkable. It's quite remarkable. But these are small victories in the long journey, but they're victories nonetheless. And I think they hopefully give some comfort that no matter where you are in the world, progress is sometimes slow, but there is always progress.
There is always, and always, as can talk about it, put it on the table and make it visible, there'll be more progress. If we don't talk about it and we think it's, it's not as important, not as necessary for it to happen or for it to be in the legal system, but it needs to be. It needs to be recognized there for it to start like washing down into every aspect of society, no?
Yeah, one of my colleagues is African American and lesbian, and she's very involved in civil rights and very involved in the LGBTQ plus community, and this is a challenging time because the issues of racial injustice are prominent for her as one extraordinarily large part of who she is, but also it's Pride Month at the same time when it's time for celebrating, and these decisions come along, and it can be sort of rather jarring of like sort of trying to sort of deal with the seriousness of racial equality and social justice at the same time as celebrate this magnificent victory in the courts. But she had a great line that I thought really sort of like settled it for me. She says, "Our work is never done, but the conversations have to start." And to me, that's just illustrates two things. One, that progress is iterative. It will take time, but there is there. But what it hopefully does is also start a conversation. So we have a conversation around what this means in the courts. It may mean a small, let's call it, extension of rights for I think the 32 states that didn't have these protections in place. But what it means is people now talking about it. And so saying, I can't believe that your rights weren't protected in the workplace, that you could somehow be dismissed summarily because you were gay or because you were married to a man or you were a lesbian, whatever it may be, or you're a transsexual. It's just incredible to think that that people didn't know that those civil rights weren't afforded to you. And so it lifts, as you said before, it lifts everyone's conversancy. And hopefully, again, these judgments are big in terms of their impact on lives, but hopefully bigger in terms of the conversation that will spark to the next progress that we can make.
Exactly, and I love that. Now let's talk about intersectionality. Yourself as an employee and as a member of the LGBT community, you are also an ally to other groups that are fighting for equality. How do we do this without becoming crowding, but not losing focus, and also helping out and sharing the experience and whatever the community has learned throughout the years with other groups?
Yeah, look, I don't think equality is a scarce resource. Some people may think it is. I think it's a public good. That my use of equality doesn't necessarily reduce your availability to equality. It is inexhaustible, really, if you think about it. It really is inexhaustible. But a lot of people think it is a scarce resource, that for me to win, you have to lose, or to you lose, I have to win. And I just don't accept that. I think that equality is something where we can both win. And again, it is something that is inexhaustible. It's just we probably haven't found the right source yet. And so I think in many ways what we are seeing is that as our rights do improve, no matter where we are in the world. I mean, clearly progress is very slow in certain very conservative countries. But we are seeing, more and more countries sort of moving towards a more equitable. It doesn't crowd out someone else's rights. It may make people uncomfortable, but that goes to the conversation point I mentioned before, is that it actually sparks a conversation, and hopefully the conversation leads to a better understanding of why someone's rights are not going to be impinged if someone else's rights are given, an airing, or those rights are extended to a new class of individuals. So again, I sort of think to myself, like, back to that, the diversity is a strength of our community, and we have to think about that more broadly as well when we think about intersectionality. That we can do gender equality and racial equality and LGBTQ plus rights. We can save the environment. These things aren't inexhaustible. Now, sometimes it requires a bit of sequencing, but that sequencing doesn't mean to sort of say someone's relegated. And I think that sometimes, we sometimes forget that, just being where the sequence of these issues lie, can sometimes feel that we are either having our rights being pushed to the background or somehow others feel that we're getting our issues on the agenda more prominently than others. And that's the sort of I suppose the nature of politics is, it's often seen as the art of the possible. Well, I think that's a rather sort of, a defeatist way to look at things. I don't think that politics should be the art of the possible. It should be really the art of the potential. And so in many ways, I think what we should do is lift up our sights about what politics can do for us. At the same time, get politically involved and sort of use our voice, use our franchise to make our voices known. But I think I go back to my original point is I don't think that equality is a scarce resource. I think it is a public good. But every now and then we just have to work out that maybe someone's need of their time to have their issues seen and to have the space to occupy is important. And I think, if I even just think about this, the Pride Month, as we mentioned before, is right now. At the same time of the issues of racial equality and justice are so pronounced. What I've seen just incredibly respectful and diverse thinking about the way in which people are using Pride Month to shine a light on racial equality, because 51 years since the Stonewall riots, was all about sort of standing up for injustice, standing up for police brutalities, actually, if you go back over the history. And so why not a modern day, LGBTQ plus movement started with a reaction to police oppression, a protest movement turned into a progress movement. And so not surprisingly, I think a lot of people in our community are looking at Pride Month in a different way. We are celebrating, of course, our progress, but we can shine a light on the progress that needs to be made for other minority groups who are suffering, terrible injustice. We know what that feels like. So again, this reverse allyship. So how can we think about giving up our time, our resources, sometimes even our airtime to the needs that they have?
I love that. In love for all, one should be left behind. And in Mexico, especially, there's so many inequalities and there's so many diversity, not only the LGBT, there's ethnical, there's gender, there's even access to education makes for a huge divide. So yes, it is very important that we understand that as much as one community has the need and the right to fight for equality, it's the same right and the same need that all other groups or all other diversities have, because there's really not one normal, there's just one, one whole humanity that we should all try to regroup and work together towards one.
And and Lou, I think if this pandemic has proven anything, is some things are universal. We're all dealing with a global pandemic. Sometimes economic recessions have hit some countries. Sometimes a natural disaster. I hear one hit Oaxaca only today. These things can be isolated and pocketed, and people can feel sorry one day and forget the next. I think maybe what the environment we're in has given us all a little bit of time to think about sort of like our roles in the world, the inequality we see. We certainly see, the advent of an economic downturn, recession. Some people are calling for even worse than, saying it's going to be even worse than that. But I think, this time that we've had, sometimes in isolation, has not sort of reduced our solidarity. And so in some ways, how do we think about the needs of others? Just as we would think about, wearing a mask to make sure someone else was protected if we were unwell. How do we take that same approach to thinking about equality more broadly? How do I make sure that whatever I do doesn't affect negatively someone else, that I actually think about their welfare at the same time? I don't, in some ways, think that we should stop about thinking about welfare just in terms of illness, part of a pandemic or a contagion. Let's think about that more broadly when we think about equality.
I love that. And let's finish the conversation with that. Of course, after the pandemic, there's going to be this new normal that everyone's now talking about, and that affects the companies and affects corporations. How are they going to deal with equality? How will they deal with their LGTB employees during the pandemic? Will there be more care, less care? What do you see there, and how can we bring a more unified view into companies?
Yeah, look, maybe it's three things, because we had a similar discussion around this a few weeks ago. So, these thoughts are a little bit formed a few weeks ago. We were asked sort of like, what does this mean, in a pandemic for our community? And we thought there were three things that sort of came to mind. One was just the need for visibility. We're all living behind screens. We're all living, in a little bit more social isolation than any of us have ever thought, was possible. And for our community, visibility is one of our weapons. It's a strength that we have. And certainly Pride Month is, it's about being visible. It's one of the months of the year where we actually, sort of use that time to, demonstrate, to, celebrate, to, in many ways, just to, be prominent and to make sure people haven't forgotten the progress we need to make. But as so many of us have sort of retreated to our homes, sitting behind a screen like this, the ability to be able to be visible has been affected. And this means this is not just simply to our community. I think there's communities and minorities that are, who need visibility to progress their issues. And so we need to think differently. If we're all going to still be in an environment like this for some time, how do we ensure that, a webcam, or a photo on your phone is not the only way you can get visible? How do we sort of change that mentality? And it's going to be hard, because we traditionally want to come together and celebrate. So we're going to have to try to do that in different ways. And even just this video call we're having is a great example of us, maybe showing some visibility. So I'm really incredibly thankful to Love for All for the opportunity. So there's that. The second one is just around the potential retreat in progress we have seen. Around the world, there's something like 180 countries that still don't allow, for marriage equality. 77 countries still have laws on the statutes that either criminalize or have, really strong restrictions against same-sex behavior. And some have still got, and there's more recent examples of this, of, some still have, I think 7 countries at the last count, still have capital punishment, and we were seeing, in some ways, progress. We were seeing sort of the global solidarity, as I mentioned before. We're seeing the progress even in the Supreme Court here in the United States. Unfortunately, what we're going to sort of see is probably government's attention move increasingly to, saving the economy, saving their communities. And so I think what we are going to have to deal with is maybe just a slower progress than we've seen in the past, just as governments sort of turn their attention to maybe sort of what they think more urgent needs are. Now, you can do both. You can still deal with equality and an economy at the same time. Indeed, I think what we need to sort of have is a more inclusive recovery than ever before. Let's hope that inclusive recovery also, deals with LGBTQ+ rights. The final thing is around allyship. I think and this sort of goes back to an answer I gave a little earlier, that so many people have showed us incredible allyship, in our fight for equality, and just the number of people who responded to, again, the Supreme Court ruling last week has been extraordinary. But another Supreme Court ruling, which obviously does impact many Mexicans, was the decision in the DACA case, where it allowed for those who had deferred the childhood arrivals to still remain in the country, which would affect a number of people who are, from Mexico originally. And the incredible outpouring of support for those individuals who were affected, the 700,000 that could be affected by that decision, was incredible from our community as well. And so this need for us to also to give grace and to give our sense of, again, allyship to others, celebrate their success, even if it sometimes means that we're sort of going to be a little quieter around our own. But I think that what that demonstrates is that, this important value exchange and allyship is incredible. We understand the incredible investment that people have made, sometimes courageously, to stand up for us. that why wouldn't we sort of, return that investment back when they need our support as well? And so I think that final thing of allyship, I think people have a better understanding of what that means when other minority groups, when other people who need, their civil rights to be respected, that they need their personal freedoms to be safeguarded, that we still have something to give.
I love that. Thank you so much. What would you say to a young person, maybe who's living or in the situation you might have been 25 years or 30 years ago when you were testing the water, seeing how you would come out? What message would you give them?
I would start with your family first. This month I unfortunately, sort of celebrate. I recognize my parents passed away in this month at different times many years ago, and I never had a chance to tell them, about my sexual orientation. And I feel that I robbed myself of that opportunity to let them know who their son really was. And in many ways, that was just my naivety, my immaturity, sometimes, again, my covering, just to sort of make sure I didn't make them feel uncomfortable. But I know that they knew. My brothers and sisters says I was the last to know. And so I would sort of say, don't be surprised how important your family will be. They can be sometimes the toughest audience that you have to be able to sort of to come out. But I think your family will surprise you more often than not. Now, that is not everyone's experience. I completely understand that. But a lot of us see those other experiences and we assume that that's going to be ours. And so if you know your family, love you, if you love your family, give them the grace to respond in a way which may surprise you. And then that will start your life in a very different way. You'll be better at work. You'll be better with your friends. You'll be a better husband. You'll be a better wife. You'll be a better partner. You'll just be better. And maybe that just starts with the family, because it's such an important, unit to everything we do. Why wouldn't we at least start there to be our honest and authentic self with the people we love? They will surprise you.
Oh, great. Thank you so much, John. Thank you for your time and for sharing all this with the Love for All audience.
Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. Gracias, queridos amigos. Fue un gusto tener esta conversación y espero que sigan disfrutando de los contenidos de Love for All.
Hey, I'm Dylan Marin, and I host the podcast Conversations with People Who Hate Me, where I have a discussion with people who have said negative or homophobic things about me. Today, I'm speaking with members of the LGBTQ+ community at Microsoft to discuss their experiences. This is The More We Talk, the More We Understand.
Hi, I'm SG.
My name is Alina.
My name is Lisejo.
I'm Clayton.
Great, yay, we're all here. Let's talk about a time where you felt misunderstood.
My parents, they kept misgendering me, using the wrong pronouns. Eventually, my mom asked, "Why is this so important to you?"
This man approached me and he said very loudly, "Look, we have some ladyboy action going on here." It really shook me.
I just, kept dodging the bullet of, why I don't have a boyfriend.
When I produced the driver's license, it's got female particulars. And then the traffic officer would be like, "But sir, are you sure this is your driver's license?"
My entire life, I've had to convince people that I'm queer enough.
How do we get people who aren't in the queer community to be part of the conversation?
I really believe in the power of empathy and recognizing that it's kind of easy to hate something that you don't know.
I always try and start with what I call the magical opening question, which is, tell me about you.
I tend to stay calm and see things from their point of view and try to meet them where they're at.
I always try to start from a place of positivity.
It's trying to humanize myself so that they can see me as a human, as a person.
We should only be having the conversations that deserve our energy. Do we feel that this person isn't going to try and debate the very core of who I am?
I do feel like it can be a debate at times, and I think it becomes a question of how much emotional labor can I put into this conversation?
Debating is inevitable in the place that I live with almost every conversation.
I am ready to say, no, I'm with my boyfriend.
I need to be careful, not just of myself, but also, of the people around me.
Now I'm at a point
and a phase in my life where it's not always our job to educate.
Change doesn't happen with one conversation.
Every conversation I have, what I think about is my kid. No matter how he may identify in the future, every conversation that I can have and I can start benefits him. Every conversation that all the generations before us had allow me to be who I am right now.
Simply living, simply existing is a radical act, and I'm proud of you all for it. Leaning into the conversations you feel safe having could be its own form of a small radical act. So I guess that's the final note that I want to leave on.
This is really very important. Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Yes!